She stood on my lawn, arms crossed, staring at the flagpole. "It violates Regulation 12B, she said, handing me a notice with a $1,000 fine. I didn't even finish reading it, because that pole, that was my son's final gift before he shipped out. But what she didn't know, he's not just a soldier. My name's Daniel Hart. I'm 53, a retired mechanic and a father to one, my son, Michael. I've lived in this same house for over 20 years. It's nothing fancy, but the porch has seen 1,000 quiet mornings, and the backyard's where I taught Michael to throw a football. It's home." Last year, just before he deployed overseas, Michael came home for a weekend. He brought a gift, said it wasn't much, just something he'd built himself at the base wood shop. It was a flagpole, 16 feet tall, sanded smooth, a little brass finial at the top. We installed it together, dug the hole, poured the concrete, raised it straight. And when he left that Sunday afternoon, I watched him drive off with the stars and stripes waving behind him. It was his way of saying, "I'll come back." So when the HOA sent a letter demanding I remove it, calling it unsightly and non-compliant, it didn't feel like a rule. It felt like erasure, like someone was trying to wipe away the one thing holding me steady while my boy was away. That's why this matters. Not because it's just a pole, but because it's a promise. And I don't take promises lightly. Where are you watching from? And have you ever had something small that meant everything to you? Stick with me. Because what started with a flagpole turned into a fight for memory, respect, and the right to stand tall, no matter who's watching. I always believed that a good neighborhood wasn't about fences or bylaws. It was about quiet mornings, familiar faces, and the kind of peace you don't have to explain. Mine was like that, a cul-de-sac just outside of town, lined with modest homes, weather-worn porches, and maple trees that turned fire red in October. We had backyard cookouts in the summer, snow angels in the winter, and the kind of neighborly nods that meant everything without saying a word. My house sat third from the end, a small one-story with a blue tin roof and a screened-in porch that creaked like an old rocking chair. The flower beds out front were always full, snapdragons in the spring, marigolds in the fall, and my garage had more tools than I'd ever use, even in retirement. Nothing fancy, just the kind of place you grow into. Michael grew up here. From toddler tantrums on the kitchen floor to late-night talks on the back steps, this place held the echoes of his whole life. He joined the Army after high school, said he wanted to do something bigger than himself. I didn't argue. I just hugged him and said, "Come home standing tall." During his last visit before deployment, we didn't talk about fear. We talked about the things that ground you: barbecue ribs, Sunday football, and, surprisingly, flagpoles. He told me he'd been helping one of the base commanders install a ceremonial one, said he liked the feel of it, solid, upright, unshakable. The next morning, he backed into the driveway with a flatbed trailer. I thought maybe it was another toolbox or engine block, but no, there it was. A hand-built 16-foot wooden flagpole, varnished smooth, strong enough to hold up in a storm. "This is yours," he said, "so you don't forget that I'm still standing, no matter where I go." We installed it together, just to the right of the front steps, dug 2 feet deep, mixed the concrete by hand, and waited while it set. We hoisted it upright at sunset, just as the cicadas began to hum. I raised the flag the next morning, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something solid in my chest, something like peace. It wasn't just wood and rope, it was a reminder. Every time I saw it, it reminded me that he made it home once, and he'd make it home again. Life went back to its rhythms after that. I'd wake up at 6 o'clock, make a pot of black coffee, and sit on the porch watching the flag flutter in the morning light. It became part of the house, part of the neighborhood. Folks would walk by and nod at it. Some even saluted. The mailman once told me it made his route feel more American. I chuckled and said, "That's my boy's doing." Saturdays were my favorite. I'd mow the lawn, then crack a cold beer in the afternoon sun. A couple neighbors, Jim from across the street and Rita next door, would wave from their porches. Jim had an old Marine Corps cap he wore religiously. Every now and then he'd shout, "Tell that boy of yours we're proud." I always told Michael when we spoke on the phone. He'd just smile and say, "Tell Jim I'll buy him a beer when I'm back." There was an older woman who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac. Her name was Betty. Gray hair, sharp eyes, always out walking her beagle, Daisy. She'd nod at me most days, even gave me some tulip bulbs one spring. I figured she was just another one of those HOA board members who mostly cared about flower height and trash bins being out too long. No harm in that, really. I kept my place tidy, followed the rules, paid my dues. And up to that point, the HOA had been mostly background noise. You'd get an occasional email reminder about painting your mailbox or trimming hedges, but it wasn't invasive. We all just wanted peace, and we had it. The flagpole never came up. Not once. Then one morning, about 4 months after Michael deployed, I noticed something odd. Betty didn't wave, just walked past, eyes fixed on the flag, slower than usual. Daisy tugged on the leash, but Betty didn't move until the wind shifted and the flag caught a breeze. She blinked, turned, and kept walking. I thought maybe she was just having an off day. We all have those. But the next week, another small thing changed. I caught someone, probably a kid, snapping a photo of the flagpole from the sidewalk. He ran off before I could say hello. Didn't seem like a neighbor I recognized. Still, I didn't think too much of it. You learn to live with a little weirdness when you're a parent with a son overseas. What matters is keeping the rhythm, the porch, the peace. That rhythm carried me through the holidays, through letters from Michael and one grainy video call on Christmas Eve. The flag stayed up through rain and snow, holding firm, just like he said it would. Looking back, I realized that peace was a fragile thing. It lasted just long enough for me to believe it would never be taken. And then, right when the tulips were starting to bloom again, it arrived. A letter. From the HOA. Single-spaced, bold lettering. A violation notice. Unauthorized structure exceeding vertical regulation, it read, must be removed within 10 days or face fines of $100 per day, and at the top, printed neatly in the header, complaint issued by Elizabeth Carter. Betty, the same Betty who once gave me tulip bulbs, who used to wave every morning, who walked Daisy past my house for years without saying a word. Something had changed, but I hadn't. And neither had the pole. I reread the letter 3 times, thinking maybe I missed something. Some small mistake, some hint that it wasn't real. But no, it was official. HOA header, board stamp, typed signature at the bottom. The violation was real, and the demand was clear. Remove the flagpole, or start paying $100 a day. No room for discussion. I sat with that letter for a while. The flag outside fluttered calmly in the wind, innocent, steady, like it always had been. But now, suddenly, it was a problem. An unauthorized vertical structure, as if my son's gift had no meaning beyond measurements on a page. I called the HOA office the next morning. The woman who answered was polite, almost too polite. She didn't seem surprised when I gave my name. "Yes, Mr. Hart," she said. "That file is already open. The issue was raised by a board member, Mrs. Carter. It appears the structure wasn't approved through the proper channels." "Structure?" I asked. "You mean the flagpole?" "Yes, sir." "It's been there for 4 months." "Yes, but it wasn't approved prior to installation." I swallowed hard. "It's not a gazebo, it's a flagpole. My son built it. He's serving overseas." There was a pause. Then, "I'm sorry, sir. I can only tell you that any vertical installation over 6 feet requires formal review under Article 3, Section 4 of the Community Guidelines." I didn't yell, didn't curse. I just said thank you and hung up. That afternoon, I saw her, Betty Carter, standing at the end of her driveway. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She just watched as I lowered the flag for the evening. Her eyes didn't follow me. They stayed locked on the pole itself. Something had shifted in her, or maybe it had always been there, just hidden behind polite nods and tulip bulbs. The next day, the emails started. First came a reminder, bland, formal. "This is your second notice of violation regarding the unauthorized flagpole." Then came a warning. "Please be advised that non-compliance may result in further enforcement actions." And finally, what felt like the beginning of a campaign, an invitation to attend the next board meeting to resolve the issue amicably. I didn't go. Not because I was avoiding it, but because I already knew what I'd find. A room full of folded arms and polite smiles hiding sharpened teeth. Instead, I walked the neighborhood, talked to a few folks. Jim, across the street, was furious. "You're kidding," he said. "For a flagpole? Hell, mine's metal and twice as tall." Rita from next door. R was more cautious. She glanced over both shoulders before speaking. "Betty's been different lately," she whispered. "Ever since her grandson moved in with her, she joined the board, got real serious about order and aesthetics. She told me last month my garden statues were distracting." Others were less willing to talk. A few didn't answer their doors. Some waved but quickly turned away. The silence wasn't personal, it was survival. People around here knew how HOAs worked. One complaint could become a campaign. It was safer not to get involved. Still, the flag stayed up. Every morning I raised it. Every night I lowered it. The pole stood firm, concrete base unshaken, and that seemed to bother her even more. A week later I found a printed note in my mailbox. No envelope, no name, just a crisp piece of paper folded twice. Veterans deserve respect, but rules are rules. Please comply before this becomes a legal issue. It didn't say thank you. It didn't say sincerely. It wasn't written to start a conversation. It was written to win. That same day, Betty began walking Daisy along a different path. Past my house, twice a day, sometimes more. She'd pause at the end of my driveway, not long enough to say something, just long enough to make sure I noticed, and every time she stared at the pole like it was a weed she couldn't pull. Then came the garbage can complaint. I'd always kept my trash bins tucked behind the garage, but suddenly I got another notice, this time for visible waste receptacles during non-pickup hours. The wording was identical, precise, passive-aggressive, signed again by B. Carter, board liaison. It didn't take long to realize what this really was. This wasn't about the pole, it was about control, about setting an example. The flagpole was symbolic, yes, but more than that, it was mine, and that made it dangerous to someone like Betty. She didn't want compromise. She wanted obedience, quiet compliance, a neighborhood where nothing stood taller than the board itself. At night, I found myself staring at the ceiling, hearing the wind rustle through the flag outside, wondering how far she'd go. Would they try legal action? Would they send someone to remove it themselves? I imagined waking up one morning to find it gone, cut down like it never mattered. I started keeping a folder, copies of every notice, time-stamped, photos of the pole from every angle, even a short video I took with my phone, narrating what it meant and when it was installed, just in case. Because it was starting to feel like I was being cornered, slowly, methodically. Betty wasn't just a neighbor now, she had become something else entirely. A self-appointed guardian of conformity, and my son's flagpole had become a threat to that fragile illusion of order she held onto so tightly. What she didn't know was this: I wasn't about to take that pole down, not now, not ever. But I wasn't going to shout or scream. That's not how you win wars like this. No, I had something stronger than outrage. I had the truth. And soon, I'd have the law on my side too. By the second month, the tone of the letters changed. They weren't just polite threats anymore. They were warnings soaked in legal jargon and cold efficiency. The third notice arrived in a thick envelope, certified mail this time. Inside was a printed document with color photographs of my house, aerial shots and street view angles, each one annotated with little red arrows pointing to the flagpole like it was a crime scene. They'd filed an official notice of non-compliance with penalty accrual. According to them, I now owed $2,100 in fines, accruing daily. They claimed the pole was a clear violation of architectural consistency standards and had repeatedly disregarded board-mandated requests for resolution. I read it 3 times in silence. Then I folded it neatly and set it beside my coffee cup. That same morceau. Ning, I stepped outside and noticed something different. The air felt tighter, still. I looked up and saw it. The flag was gone. The pole stood there, solid, undisturbed, but the flag I had folded every night and raised each morning was missing. My heart froze. I scanned the lawn, the driveway, the hedges. Nothing. No sign of wind damage, no torn cloth or broken clip. Someone had taken it. No note, no apology, just absence. I stood there for what felt like hours. Not angry, not yet, just hollow. Then I went inside and opened the drawer in the hallway cabinet, pulled out the spare, folded crisp, pressed and waiting. Michael had given me 2. In case something happens, he'd said, like he knew. I raised the new flag that morning in silence. No music, no fanfare, just hands, rope, and breath. But something in me had shifted. This wasn't about a regulation anymore. This was personal. It wasn't long before the fines became formal liens. Another letter informed me that the HOA had voted to initiate property lien procedures in accordance with their governing documents. They claimed authority to recoup unpaid fines by placing a lien on my home. They wanted to mark my house like a delinquent. I'd lived there for 2 decades, paid every tax, shoveled every inch of sidewalk, painted the shutters every spring, and now they wanted to stain it on paper because of a flagpole? I went to the next HOA meeting. Not to plead, just to watch. The room smelled of coffee and fresh print toner. The folding chairs were arranged in tight rows. There were a dozen residents, a folding table of board members, and a plastic pitcher of water sweating in the corner. Betty sat at the center of the table, clipboard in hand, glasses perched at the tip of her nose like they'd been placed there by God. She didn't acknowledge me. They moved through the agenda with robotic precision. Landscaping schedules, espotown. Wrinkler repairs, repainting a speed bump. Then came item number 8. Flagpole violation, Lot 3C. That was me. Betty cleared her throat and began. The issue at Lot 3C continues to reflect ongoing defiance of community standards. The resident has ignored multiple notices, resulting in over $2,800 in assessed fines as of this date. The board recommends enforcement per Section 9.4 of our compliance policy. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. I raised my hand. Betty froze for half a second, then nodded once. I didn't install a billboard, I said. It's a flagpole. My son's flagpole. He made it with his hands before deploying. No response, just paper shuffling and throat clearing. I understand rules. I've followed them for 20 years. But this is wrong. Still nothing. Betty replied in her practiced tone. We sympathize, Mr. Hart, but the board cannot make exceptions for individual circumstances. Individual circumstances? You mean sacrifice, service, memory? I didn't argue. I just stood up and left. That night, another anonymous letter appeared. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten with careful block letters. If the rules don't apply to you, why should they apply to the rest of us? The isolation began subtly after that. Jim across the street stopped waving. Rita no longer chatted on her porch. The couple next door began parking their car at an odd angle, blocking part of my driveway. When I asked politely if they could shift over a few feet, they told me to talk to the HOA. Even Daisy, the beagle, stopped walking past. And Betty? Betty started adding new violations to her list. One for overgrown vegetation when I let my azaleas bloom past the hedgerow. One for improper storage because I left a watering can visible on my back steps. One for vehicle inconsistency because my son's old truck was parked out front on weekends when my brother borrowed the a rage. All within 2 weeks. They weren't just enforcing bylaws anymore. They were trying to drown me in paper cuts. One morning, I caught someone photographing my backyard over the fence. I couldn't see their face, just the top of a phone and a flash of movement. By the time I got outside, they were gone. I filed a police report, but without a license plate or footage, it was just a footnote. A few days later, someone dumped lawn clippings in my trash bin so it would overflow and trigger a violation. And then, quietly, the real reason behind the pressure began to emerge. It started with a casual remark from the mailman. They say your lot's going to be worth a lot more once the HOA gets full compliance, he said, not realizing what it meant. I looked into it. Turns out the board had recently applied for a zoning variance to convert several properties on our street, including mine, into enhanced value parcels eligible for redevelopment incentives. The catch? All properties had to be code pure. No exceptions, no flagpoles, no personal history, just clean lawns and empty hearts. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about rules. This was about flipping the neighborhood. And my flagpole, it was the last thing standing in their way. But what they didn't know, what they'd never understand, was that I wasn't alone. Not really. Because my son, he may have been overseas, but he'd given me the one thing they couldn't erase, a reason to stand my ground. They thought I was just a mechanic, just another quiet man with gray hair and old boots who'd give up when things got complicated. But what Betty and her clipboard crew didn't know was that I spent 27 years fixing more than just engines. I spent those years repairing everything the world tried to break, from machines to men. And I didn't scare easy. After I pieced together the zoning scam, everything changed. I stopped react and started documenting. I bought a trail cam and mounted it behind the azalea bush, facing the flagpole and driveway. Motion activated, infrared, time-stamped, not just for trespassers, but for proof. I installed another above the garage, angled toward the street, quiet little eyes that didn't blink. I kept a logbook now too, handwritten, every letter, every photo, every violation, because this wasn't just about my home anymore. This was about every quiet veteran who came home to a different kind of war. Every widow who planted roses outside her husband's workshop and got told it was not in harmony with community aesthetics. Every flag that stood for something real in a neighborhood built on synthetic perfection. But most of all, it was about my son and the promise we made, hammering that flagpole into the earth like it was an anchor. I started digging into the HOA's filings, pulled the articles of incorporation from the county clerk's office. Betty hadn't just joined the board, she'd rewritten half the rules. The old charter had been amended 6 months prior, adding new clauses about vertical ornamentation, structural compliance, and legacy exceptions revoked. She'd wiped out the protections that once allowed for war memorials and decorative liberty poles, calling them ambiguous loopholes. Smart, but sloppy. Because in changing those protections, she triggered a clause requiring formal notification to all residents within 30 days. And guess what? No such notice had ever been sent. I also contacted the Veterans Memorial Defense Fund. I'd heard of them years ago, a non-profit that offers legal support to protect symbolic tributes on private property, especially those involving deployed service members. A man named Clayton returned my call, calm voice, precise questions. And when I told him what had happened, the flagpole, the threats, the liens, he didn't hesitate. "We'll take this case," he said, "and you're not paying a dime." Turns out there's a federal statute most HOA boards conveniently forget, the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005. It says no residential association can prohibit the display of the U.S. flag on a member's property within reasonable limits without violating federal law. And that pole, 16 feet, no electrical components, no obstruction of sidewalks or lines of sight, that was well within reason. Clayton assigned a legal intern to help me gather more evidence. She was young, sharp, and knew how to dig. Within a week, she found 3 previous complaints against Betty Carter from her time in another HOA, 2 for retaliation, 1 for falsifying inspection records. It didn't go anywhere back then. But here, it was starting to paint a pattern. Meanwhile, I started recording every interaction. When another violation notice came taped to my door, this time for excessive wind noise from outdoor flag materials, I didn't flinch. I photographed the tape placement, logged the time, and compared it to the HOA's bylaws. Guess what? They were using an outdated version of the noise code from 2 charter cycles ago. Invalid. Betty was slipping. And that's when I remembered something else. My cousin Harold. He's not just family, he's a state code enforcement auditor. We don't talk often, but when I explained what was happening, he got real quiet. "You have the right to request a compliance audit," he said. "It's not public knowledge, but it's legal. If their enforcement exceeds scope or bypasses required notice, every fine they issued could be invalidated retroactively." He sent me the request forms the next day. It wasn't dramatic. No confrontation, just a signature, a quiet act of resistance filed with the state. The gears were turning now, but not in their machine. In mine. Then came the proof I didn't expect. One of the trail cameras. Has caught something. It was late, around 2:13 a.m. A figure crept into the frame near the pole. Hoodie, gloves, slowly tugging at the flag clips. It wasn't a kid. Too tall, too calculated. They unclipped the flag, folded it, sloppy like they didn't know how, and disappeared into the dark. Time-stamped. Crystal clear. I sent it to Clayton. "That's theft," he said, "and possibly intimidation." He looped in the county sheriff's office. I didn't press charges, yet. But now I had something even more powerful than punishment. Leverage. The best part? It wasn't just me anymore. When the word got out that the HOA was targeting a veteran's father over a flagpole, the community started to whisper, then murmur, then talk. Jim from across the street came over one morning with a bag of screws and a socket wrench. "Thought you might want to double bolt that base plate," he said. "And Rita?" She brought cookies and an old newspaper clipping. It was Michael, on the front page in uniform. She'd kept it from his first deployment. "I thought you might want a second copy," she said, "just in case." "And Betty?" She stopped walking Daisy past my house. She started sending notices through legal counsel instead. That's how I knew I had her. She wasn't fighting me anymore. She was hiding behind the bylaws she used to weaponize, and I was done hiding. The date was set. The next HOA meeting would include a formal challenge to my fines based on unlawful procedural changes and federal statute violations. But I had one last piece to drop before the public showdown, and I saved it for the end, because this wasn't just about exposing corruption. This was about reclaiming dignity. The night before the meeting, I stood outside, just past dusk, flag rippling in the wind, porch light warm on my shoulders. I looked at the pole, ran my fingers over the grain, felt the ridges where my son's initials were carved in tiny block letters. Near the base, MH, 22nd Inf, and I knew something Betty never would. This flagpole didn't need a permit, because it already had purpose. And tomorrow, so would I. The day of the meeting, the air felt sharper than usual. Maybe it was the nerves, or the storm clouds gathering just past the ridge. Either way, something was about to break. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in my best, collared shirt, clean jeans, the wristwatch Michael had given me when he graduated boot camp. The flag still fluttered quietly behind me as I locked the front door. The meeting was held in the community rec hall, linoleum floors, beige folding chairs, those humming fluorescent lights that make everything feel a little too clinical. The board sat in their usual spots behind a long table, stacks of paperwork at their elbows like a fortress. Betty Carter sat in the center, glasses low, hair perfectly pinned, her expression unreadable. There were more residents than usual, a lot more, maybe 40, maybe 50. Word had spread. Whispers, Facebook posts, a few screenshots from the letters I'd received. Neighbors who had stayed quiet were now curious, maybe even ready to choose a side. I wasn't the only one who brought backup. Clayton, my attorney from the Veterans Memorial Defense Fund, stood beside me, calm as a priest at a funeral, tall, well-dressed, with a folder in one hand and the law in the other. Betty began the meeting with her usual calm, landscaping updates, budget reallocations, a motion to install speed bumps near the playground, all business as usual. Until she reached item number 7 on the agenda. She cleared her throat. Tonight we will review the case regarding Lot 3C, Mr. Hart's ongoing compliance violations and associated fines. The board has made repeated efforts to resolve this issue amicably. Unfortunately, those efforts have been rejected. She looked up from her papers and met my eyes for the first time in weeks. We are prepared to proceed with lien certification. A few gasps came from the crowd. Jim across the street furrowed his brow. Rita sat forward in her chair. I stood slowly. Clayton stepped up with me and placed the folder on the table in front of the board. Before the board proceeds with it, he said, I'd like to formally request a reading of the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005, Section 3, Clause A. Betty blinked. Excuse me? Clayton opened the folder. Federal law prohibits a homeowners association from banning the display of the U.S. flag on residential property, provided it does not pose safety concerns or violate public law. The flagpole in question stands 16 feet tall, is set in concrete, and is not in violation of any municipal code. He looked around the room. And more importantly, it was a gift from Mr. Hart's son before his deployment. The silence was absolute. Even the HVAC system seemed to hold its breath. Clayton continued. Furthermore, he said, flipping to the next page, we have documentation proving that the HOA's amended charter was enacted without proper notification, in violation of your own articles of incorporation. As such, the fines issued against Mr. Hart are unenforceable. Betty sat very still. Her knuckles whitened on her clipboard. Then I stepped forward, holding the still photo, the trail cam image of the hooded figure stealing my flag. I turned it to face the room. This was taken on April 11th at 2:13 a.m. That's not vandalism. That's targeted theft. A woman in the front row gasped. Clayton passed out copies of the image to the board. Our client has filed a report with the county sheriff and will pursue civil action if necessary. We also have a formal compliance audit request pending with the State Housing Authority, which, should it proceed, will trigger a full review of this board's enforcement practices over the last 18 months. Now Betty spoke. Her voice wavered just slightly. These are serious allegations. They are facts, Clayton said, sharply but calmly, and we're happy to present them in court or right here in front of the entire community. A murmur spread across the room. Jim stood up. This is ridiculous, he said. Dan's been a good neighbor for 20 years. That flagpole, that's his son's legacy. If that's a problem, then the problem ain't him. Another neighbor stood, then another. Even Rita raised her voice. You gave me a violation for gnomes, she said. 3 inches too tall. I didn't say anything because I didn't want trouble, but this is shameful. Betty tried to regain control. Please, let's keep this civil. But she was losing the room. The authority she once held like a badge was slipping away. Clayton calmly submitted the final document, a formal request for dismissal of all fines, voiding of the lien, and a censure motion against Betty Carter for procedural misconduct. You may vote now, he said, or we will escalate this to county and federal oversight. The rest of the board looked between themselves, rattled and unsure. Finally, the vice chair, a man named Ronald who rarely spoke, cleared his throat. I vote to dismiss all fines and end enforcement, he said. 2 others nodded in agreement. Betty remained silent, but it didn't matter. She had been outvoted, outmaneuvered, and finally out of power. After the meeting, people came up to me one by one. Some offered hugs, some just a nod. Jim slapped me on the back. About time someone stood up. Rita handed me a small American flag on a wooden stick. For the other side of the porch, she said with a smile. As for Betty, she walked out without a word, but I saw her pause at the flagpole on the way home. She looked serious. P at it, for once not with anger, but with something that looked suspiciously like regret. That night I stood on the porch with the flag raised high. The wind was gentle, the stars quiet, the pole unshaken. It wasn't just a victory, it was a reclamation of my space, my peace, my son's promise, and my right to stand tall. The morning after the meeting, I sat on the porch with my coffee and watched the sunrise stretch across the flag. It moved gently in the wind, casting slow shadows across the grass. The pole stood as still and upright as the day Michael and I had set it in the ground. But something had changed. It wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the neighborhood now, to the story we'd just lived through together. A silent, steady marker of what happens when one voice decides not to bow. By the end of that week, the board sent a formal apology letter, not just to me, but to every resident. It was brief, but the wording mattered. They admitted the charter amendments had bypassed proper notification. They acknowledged that violations had been issued without sufficient review, and they confirmed that all liens and fines issued under those faulty clauses were officially nullified. Betty Carter did not sign the letter. Her name wasn't on it at all, because 3 days after the public meeting, she stepped down from the board entirely. The notice came in a community-wide email, no explanation, no farewell, just a single line. Effective immediately, I am resigning from the HOA Board of Directors, E. Carter. Some said she'd been pressured. Others said she just couldn't face the neighborhood after what happened. I didn't join in the speculation. Truth is, I didn't need her to fall. I just needed her to stop pushing people down. The next board meeting was different. For the first time in years, people filled every seat in the rec hall. Not to fight, but to rebuild, to ask questions, to propose air changes, to make sure what happened to me wouldn't happen again. Jim was nominated to the board that night, Rita too. A motion passed to form a resident review committee, a new layer of accountability for any future enforcement decisions. Someone suggested adding a clause protecting symbolic structures related to military service, heritage, or cultural tradition. It passed unanimously. And then someone, I don't remember who, proposed a new community tradition, raising the flag together. Every 4th of July, Memorial Day, and Veterans Day, the neighborhood would gather at dawn outside my home. The flag Michael gave me would be raised in silence, then lowered at dusk. A small gesture, a shared pause. I didn't say much that night, I just nodded, and I kept that folded flag in a cedar box until the next Memorial Day came around. The house has felt different since then. Not because anything looks different, though I did repaint the shutters and fix the porch railing. It feels different because the silence doesn't sting anymore. It comforts. It wraps itself around me like a well-worn coat. Neighbors who once looked away now stop to talk. They ask about Michael, ask when he's due back. Some even leave flags in their windows or small tokens in my mailbox. A thank you card, a ribbon, a photo of their own loved one in uniform. One morning, a little girl knocked on my door, said her school was doing a project on veterans and she wanted to interview me. I told her I wasn't a veteran, but my son was. She asked if the flagpole was part of the project. I said, "No, sweetheart. That flagpole is the project." I did get a letter from Michael eventually, a long one, handwritten in his uneven scrawl, just like he used to write on birthday cards as a kid. He'd heard through a friend back home that something happened with the HOA, said he was proud of me. Then he added something I'll never forget. I built that flagpole so you'd have something to hold on to while I was gone, but now I think it's holding more than I ever imagined. Keep it standing, Dad, for both of us. He ends every letter the same way. Stay tall. These days I don't worry about inspections. I don't flinch when I get the mail, and I haven't received a single violation since the board changed hands. The trail cams are still there, but mostly they catch squirrels now. Sometimes a stray cat. Once, a raccoon that somehow managed to open the latch on my compost bin. I kept that footage. It's hilarious. But the footage of that night, the theft, that's in a different folder. Not because I'm holding on to anger, but because I'm holding on to memory. Memory of what people will do to erase things they don't understand, and how important it is to stand against that. Even when it's quiet, even when you're alone, even when it's just you, a flag, and the wind. This whole story started with 6 feet of wood and a cloth rectangle, but it became something more. It became a reminder that dignity doesn't need permission, that grief can be a monument, and that sometimes the smallest acts, a son's gift, a father's promise, can withstand the full weight of a system built on control. And so the flag stays. The pole stands. And I sit right here, every morning, with my coffee and my porch and my peace, watching the wind do what it does best, move forward. Closing line options. Pick based on tone preference. They tried to bury me in paperwork. I gave them a reason to read the fine print. The flag still stands, and so do I. They tried to take the pole. What they lost was the neighborhood. Michael built it to help me stand tall, and I did. Some things don't belong in bylaws, some things belong in the heart. If this story moved you, if you've ever had to stand your ground for something that seemed small to others but meant everything to you, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below, tell me what you're standing for. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, shared, and remembered, tap that like button, hit subscribe, and join us the next time someone says, "You can't do that here." Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest flags.